Welcome, gentle listener. Today, we shall enjoy a tale from the recent Arks of Omen campaign, one I think you may not have heard. Taken from White Dwarf 484 to 489, it shows the exploits of one of the Arks of Omen, the Herald of Misery. Yet, there are far more details in it than just a bit of a rumble. Can you detect the most important nuggets of lore contained within? And if you enjoy this presentation, as simple as it may be, please give it a like and possibly even a share. The algorithm is not very kind these days to long form, so if you enjoy it, support it. And so, welcome to the tale of the Arks of Omen, Herald of Misery. Bitter Ambition. Arks of Omen, Herald of Misery. Abaddon the Despoiler had embarked upon a campaign of acquisition, spearheaded by vast vessels known as the Arks of Omen. Each of these was a gift to a champion willing to take up the search for an esoteric prize desired by the War Master. Amongst the greatest of those who grasped the opportunity was Warpsmith Czagra of the Iron Warriors. The summons of the Despoiler was not one that could be ignored. Abaddon's challenge wormed its way across the galaxy. Demons whispered it through corrupted vox emitters. Sorcerous visions were thrust into the fever dreams of psychers. Warlords hastened to the Despoiler's side through ambition, loyalty, or fear. When Abaddon's offer seeped through into the Vorlish subsector, it was sifted from the nightmarish gibberish of the warp by the divinations of a conclave of mechanistic cyberthurges who served Warpsmith Czagra, the Grand Marshal of Ruin. This lord amongst the Iron Warriors had trodden a years-long path of destruction through the subsector's string of Imperial Bastion worlds and Forge Moons, fortified Xenos blood layers, and pirate strongholds. Czagra's methodical destruction of those he conquered had long ago become an obsession. Where other Chaos warlords raised blasphemous idols or displayed the gory remnants of the foe's champions, the Warpsmith made examples of his enemies' every edifice. Though most already lay broken in mountains of Cyclopean rubble, Czagra pummeled remnant structures to their deepest foundations with orbital bombardments. Tectonic plates fractured, drowning whatever remained in geysers of molten lava. Czagra had come to conclude every such act of meticulous annihilation by searing a vast skull-shaped sigil into the site of his victories, stamping his mark on the defeated world with surgical lance strikes for all to see. When Abaddon's offer reached Czagra, he was inflicting such a cruel fate upon the once formidable fortress world of Narrator. The Warpsmith weighed Abaddon's message as he worked. His horde was already mighty, yet an Ark of Omen represented an awesome potential for greater destruction. With glacial inevitability, Czagra's ambitions widened to encompass the power on offer. He envisioned a space-borne fortress the size of a planetoid, laying siege to entire worlds. By the time Warpsmith Czagra departed the Vorlish subsector, making for the coordinates embedded in Abaddon's summons, his fleet numbered dozens of ships, an entire warband sworn or enslaved to his will. At their head, in both favour and power, was Czagra's own warband of Iron Warriors, their faces of Mendringard. Brutally efficient siege masters, these warriors had helped their lords destroy and conquer for millennia. The majority were cold-hearted veterans of the Legion's long war, everyone marked by arcane cybernetic augmentations. Exemplifying this trend, and acting as Czagra's axeman and enforcer, was the master of executions, Carbor Mandrax. His mismatched ocular bionics were said to detect his prey's souls in dizzying empiric spectra. but the conflicting neuropathic input had sent the champion insane long ago. Few of Czagra's warriors openly worshipped the Chaos Gods, but individual devotees of each of the ruinous powers were not unknown. The greatest in number were those who killed in the name of Khorne, and they were often the first to storm any breach cracked in enemy defences. However, while the Warpsmith willingly embraced the infernal power that the warp's demonic denizens offered, he was adamant that the entities know their place as tools of his will. He did not permit the presence of possessed legionaries in his ranks, and any who fell to the beguilements of demons were gunned down as an example to others who would dare exchange his authority for that of a warp-spawned entity. Many thrall bands fought at Czagra's command. The most numerous among his mortal followers were the Riven Reforged, a cult of mechanistic obsessives who idolized their Iron Warrior masters. They scavenged rusted and broken mechanisms and attached them to their bodies with crude surgeries or wore them as fetishes. Some were bent double by the weight of mostly useless machinery. Dark mechanical forces from a number of Traitor Forge worlds had made compacts with Czagra to provide him with insane warp-wrought creations and arcanotechnic viruses. Other warbands of Iron Warriors, such as the Barbican Lords and their Ferrocratic Creed, had also pledged ritualized oaths to him, along with traitor princeps of Legios, Krytos, and Rorgal, among others. Warpsmith Czagra himself rarely deigned to take the field in the opening moments of his assault, instead preferring to orchestrate his meticulously planned strategies from aboard his flagship, the Forge Maul. When the timing was right for him to make his presence felt in battle, or on rare occasions when those plans went awry and he was forced to intercede, Czagra would lead the attack in person. Clad in warped Terminator armor, the Warpsmith was an imposing and deadly combatant. In one massive gauntlet he wielded an ancient combi bolter, which fired bolts at each caged tormented spirit. Their detonations released thrumming geist waves of force that crushed enemies and disrupted battle lines. His other arm ended in a complex bronze claw of barbed servo talons, wreathed in eldritch weird fire and edged with demon chitin, with which he eviscerated enemy warriors and war engines with ease. The claiming of a monstrosity. When Czagra's fleet translated into real space at the coordinates given by Abaddon's arcane message, many of his followers were awed and disturbed by the sight that greeted them. Czagra was intrigued. Scores of traitor fleets circled each other or bullied their way into favorable positions, distrust and rancor visible in their aggressive stances. Spread amongst them were the grossly misshapen silhouettes of many space hulks. Each was surrounded by halos of sickly light and cradled in impossibly vast spider-like gantries over which swarmed demonic labourers. These vessels were the Arks of Omen, as the Despoiler summons had foretold. The titanic warships waited to be claimed by those who proved strong enough. Their mystery was something Czagra and the other aspiring Ark Masters had to seize for themselves. The vast summoning point that Czagra's fleet entered was both a hive of insane industrial engineering and a dangerous conflict zone. Threats between rival fleets spiraled into outright conflict. Battle also raged around and within several Arks of Omen, as would-be masters fought to yoke the Leviathans to their will. Czagra's fleet barged their way through lesser armadas, leaving the wrecks of dying ships in their wake. It was not long before the vengeful spirit, poised far above the cluttered mustering point, signalled him. On the bridge of the Forge Maul, every picked screen suddenly came alive with an image of Abaddon. Czagra ritually knelt before the looming Despoiler, swearing a binding oath and committing himself and his fleet to the bargain. Long moments passed before Abaddon appeared satisfied. He granted permission for Czagra's fleet to continue and transmitted coordinates for the ark he had assigned to the Warpsmith. Before cutting his signal, Abaddon informed the still kneeling Iron Warrior that the Ark had already consumed 2 eager conquerors. "Let us see," Abaddon said, the ghost of a sneer on his lips, "if you will be the 3rd. In the void, the Herald of Misery awaited its would-be master. The Herald of Misery. The space hulk that would become the Herald of Misery had been located upon the tides of the warp by the demonic master of the Soul Forges, Vashtor the Arkifane. Speared and wrenched into real space by techno-sorcerous means, it had been descended upon by the demon demigod and his legions of warp-spawn thralls who had moulded it to suit its intended purpose. From a distance, the Herald of Misery appeared to be shaped like a gigantic, blunt-nosed arrowhead, a brutal wedge of dark iron and rock. On closer inspection, it was an amalgamation of thousands of wrecked ships, fused together by the power of the warp. Individual vessel fragments over a mile in length encrusted its surface like angular metallic barnacles in comparison to the hulk's huge mass. At its tapering prow, or at least the opposite end to where Vashtor had added numerous massive engine ports, the crushed wrecks and detritus were fused with a monolithic slab of asteroidal rock. It was void-hardened, irradiated by long-dead suns, and veiled with warp-tainted strata. The Arkifane had incised hateful and mechanistic runes into the rock. They empowered the mass of dense material with a thrumming empirical resonance that turned it into a ram capable of ploughing through Imperial star forts and shaking them apart from the inside as it did so. Czagra maneuvered his fleet in a possessive, cage-like formation around the Herald of Misery. He had already constructed his strategy to enter the Ark, and he was impatient to set its pieces in motion. Czagra's orders to his fleet were simple. Theirs would be an aggressive defense of the Herald of Misery and the surrounding space. They would drive away rivals for the Ark and prey on nearby ships, enslaving them and their warbands, or else picking over their wrecks for resources. The Grand Marshal of Ruin had his takeover with the aid of his cybernetic conclave of mechanistic psychers and masters of forbidden technological lore. They assembled multi-dimensional equations and quantum portents in attempts to divine the threats inside the Ark. The Warpsmith's own immense intellect passed thousands of schemes, his thoughts flashing between his own mind and cybernetic demonic manifestations of flesh and machinery that scurried or flitted in his wake. 3 areas of control were prioritized. The largest of the Arkifane's added engine clusters, the empiric emitter of the Obeliskane, and, at the heart of an ancient starfort embedded in the vessel's twisted spine, the warp portal. Mentally compartmentalizing the Herald of Misery, Czagra divided his boarding forces into 5 large formations. The first split into numerous compact strike teams, whose task was to secure groups of ship fragments at the Ark's surface. Some of these areas would be entry points for the other 4 formations. Each were thrust into the Ark's interior from a separate location, plunging like a red-hot awl through its structure and denizens alike. Contact was soon lost between the 4 delving strike forces, the Ark's warp-tainted fabric fouling communication. Czagra had expected this and was unconcerned, knowing his sub-commanders had their orders and understood the price of failure. The 4 groups plunged deeper into the Ark, their vanguard made up of Czagra's mortal followers, cultists, mutants, traitor guardsmen, and twisted devotees of many kinds, all eminently disposable in the Warpsmith's mind. His sub-commanders employed them to test the integrity of ruptured passages or, with their deaths, warn of more insidious dangers such as rad floods or severe warp taints. For their part, Czagra's conflict of cyber-thurges hoped to use the mortal soul flares as a means of mapping the Ark's interior by monitoring their spread throughout the Herald of Misery's innards. The mortal followers were also flesh and blood bait with which to lure out lurking threats, and the Iron Warriors soon encountered these in great numbers. feral tribes of beastmen, slavering Xenos packs, sinister lone predators such as Urguls and other less identifiable creatures. Along the port side of the Herald of Misery, Czagra's forces encountered a rust-coloured fungal growth, semi-sentient and fiercely predatory, that spread through dozens of wreck fragments. Most disturbing were tremors that seemed to convulse through the Ark. Cavernous rents the breadth of escort ships honeycombed some areas, their ragged sides slick with bubbling organic matter. None who followed them ever returned. Worse was the sudden increase in grinding vibrations, deck plates buckling as something too large to comprehend squirmed its way mindlessly through the Ark. Passages and entire decks were crushed or rent apart as the thing passed. Through gaping fissures, it sent up questing pseudopods of mutant warp-tainted flesh to seize mortals and legionaries alike, dragging them out of sight. Grimzag's War Looters. Greatest of the Ark's threats was a sizable infestation of Death Skull orcs under the leadership of war boss Grimzag. Despite their anarchic savagery and scattered presence, they came to pose the most cohesive danger to Czagra's domination of the Arks of Omen. The Iron Warriors encountered them in large numbers in almost every section they fought through. The orcs had been the dominant life form within the Space Hulk before its capture by Vashtor, and they still viewed the vessel as theirs. The Greenskins had spent many happy years fighting the orcs' other denizens, looting and cobbling together all manner of mechanical treasures they discovered into strange weapons and clanking oddities. They gleefully threw themselves into the Iron Warriors at every opportunity, keen to fight the powerful legionaries, and just as eager to relieve them of weapons, armor, and twisted cybernetics. The advances made by Czagra's four forces fragmented one by one. Thousands of mortals and dozens of legionaries were lost before they began to fight their way back towards their entry points for extraction by gunships, boarding engines, and armoured umbilicals. Though furious with the failure, Czagra was utterly unmoved by his warriors' losses. Regrouping the survivors into a single corps, Czagra led the enlarged strike force in a brutally direct campaign from the Orc's stern towards the mass of fused rock at its prow. They bludgeoned their way from one wreck fragment to the next, massacring feral denizens and blunting Orc reprisals with every assault. With breaching charges, melter fire, hammers, and chain fists, the Warpsmith warriors destroyed vast sections and carved open gaping wounds into the Ark's structure. Czagra's cyberthurgic conclave unleashed eldritch binaric entities into the sections he subjugated, goading the enslaved geists to prey on recalcitrant systems and seed the spread of self-replicating cybernetic growths to engulf others. His sigil was seared into bulkheads as a visible mark of his authority. It was meaningless to any remaining denizens, but the Warpsmith understood the power of symbols on anything touched by the warp. By carving his mark into its flesh, he hoped to impress upon the Herald of Misery that its master had staked his claim. Czagra and his massed warband ploughed inexorably forward. The Orcs fought back with a number of brutal and cunning counterattacks, but at best they only managed to temporarily slow the Iron Warriors. Eventually, the majority of the Orcs were corralled into a huge maze of canted decks and fractured ship fragments near the huge blunt prow. Czagra, impatient to draw a line under the conflict, ordered the greenskins sealed into that section to be dealt with more fully en route. Departure. After weeks of grueling purges, Czagra declared himself master of the Herald of Misery. Infestations of Xenos and all manner of hidden horrors still lurked throughout the Ark, and the Orcs made repeated breakouts from where they had been driven. However, overall control had been established, and Czagra was impatient to depart. Even as the lumbering Ark swung around to leave the isolated mustering point, Czagra dispatched his own hordes of servitor thralls and cyber slaves to construct editions of his own design. They began the raising of city-sized bastions, bristling with macro cannons. They gouged vast trench systems into the agglomerated vessel surfaces, labyrinthine in design, large enough to admit the biggest god engines and boasting hidden weapon systems for miles around them. The self-appointed mouthpiece of the Warpsmith cyberthurges, the sorcerer Mekrantir, revealed that their attempts at soul-mapping the Ark's interior had failed. Empiric schemata they had prepared of large sections turned out to be woefully inaccurate. It was as if internal dimensions had altered and warped as the Iron Warriors had fought through them, chambers shifting location, passages splitting or connecting to new locations. It was impossible, he admitted to Czagra, to determine if this was due to physical subsistence within the crushed wrecks, or something hideously organic or supernatural. Czagra was privately satisfied that the Ark's seeming resistance would prove a boon should any enemy ever dare board it. Czagra gave his commands to the demonic ferryman tasked with steering the Ark, and the obeliskane was ignited, its strobing psychic beacon drawing his fleet in the vessel's wake. With a final order, preparations were made for warp translation. The Warsmith would see his part of the bargain with Abaddon fully satisfied as swiftly as possible. He wanted no lingering debt to the Warmaster. The journey would be long. They would be prey aplenty on the long route and, more importantly, time to cement his plans on how to use the Herald of Misery to wreak untold destruction once Abaddon's prize was secured. Rallion's quest. While defending a cluster of Imperial worlds, Commander Dante led a boarding party into a seemingly abandoned Arks of Omen. Within the corpse-strewn expanse of the space hulk known as Night Terror, the Blood Angels discovered mysteries beyond anything they had expected. Few loyalists had boarded an Arks of Omen. Of those, almost all who survived the experience had been too busy fighting for their lives to learn much. Commander Dante's force was thus offered a unique opportunity when they found Night Terror reduced to a drifting charnel house, and even its most monstrous denizens banished or driven into the depths. Even as Dante puzzled over the slaughtered heretics and the otherworldly foliage sprouting amongst them, his librarians found the Ark's captive warp portal. This shimmering disk of empiric energies was caged by an elaborate mechanism at the heart of a vaulted chamber. Organotechnic control shrines surrounded it. Cadaverous statues flanked a rune-inscribed ramp leading up to the portal's maw. From the distribution of slain cultists and blood-sprayed patterns, the Blood Angels could tell many heretics had died defending the portal, but the device had not been employed to summon reinforcements to the fight. After performing what divinations they could, the librarians declared that this portal was intended to receive some artifact and transport it elsewhere. Such a conclusion tallied with the scant reports of strange prizes seized by Baal fleets and spirited away to their Arks of Omen. Yet this only raised more unsettling questions. What linked these peculiar arcana? Surely even the servants of chaos were not insane enough to seal lumps of bedrock, broken machines, and time-worn statues without greater purpose. The captive portals must be intended to transport the strange prizes, but to where? Did they all go to the same place? Most maddening and ominous of all, to what end? Perhaps it was some spark of his Primarch's prescience stirring in his blood, or his great experience speaking. Whatever the case, Commander Dante knew that the answers to these questions were vital. Thus, even as he took up the quest to discover more about the mysterious force that had depopulated Night Terror, the chapter master assigned several strike forces to a different mission. Each led by a librarian and borne aboard swift sword-class frigates, these warrior bands were charged with discovering the secrets of the warp portals aboard the Arks of Omen and, through them, the dark secrets behind the artifacts seized by the Baal fleets. Strike Force Rallion. Epistolary Venato Rallian was the most senior Blood Angels librarian to board Night Terror, and he had examined its portal chamber in detail. He was a natural choice to lead one of Dante's questing forces. Rallian was a warrior mystic with over a century of combat experience, a well-respected commander who had forged honor bonds both within the Blood Angels chapter and beyond. He wasted no time in assembling his strike force from amongst those battle brothers who had won his respect during his long decades of war. Rallian himself was amongst the more gifted of the Blood Angel psychers. What truly elevated him was the precision and control with which he wielded his powers. The librarian's aspect was as carefully crafted as graven stone. His craggy features radiated reassurance, his demeanour measured wisdom. He rarely raised his voice, yet his stern words were heard by all and given great weight. So it was, too, when Rallian unleashed the powers of the warp. Eschewing pyrotechnic flair, the epistolary instead focused the tightly trammelled fury of his red thirst into pinpoint manifestations. He could puncture foes' hearts, sever their spines, or overload their delicate mechanical systems from half a battlefield away with the accuracy and power of a sniper's shot. Further augmenting both his authority and might, Rallian wielded the masterwork foresword, Sanguinius. Before this relic weapon's fury, no shield could hold, while the sight of it caused the hearts of all Blood Angels to swell with pride and determination. Several other heroes of the chapter aided Rallian in his quest. There was a sanguinary priest, Matteo Donas, an unusually dour character amongst his chapter, yet one whose deep conviction and eye for danger had long ago impressed Rallian. The two warriors fought alongside one another whenever the fates allowed. There was Verante Calmo, a tech marine possessed of a relentless determination that bordered upon the obsessive, and whose lack of charisma was more than made up for by his merciless strength of will. Then there was the dynamic Lieutenant Tasson Leodas, who was in many ways the polar opposite of both Donas and Calmo, aggressive, garrulous, and possessed of a swift wit. The lieutenant personified the most charismatic facets of his chapter's gene-sire, and was a firm favourite for those who followed him to war. The warriors Rallian led to battle were drawn from amongst the Blood Angels' 2nd and 3rd companies. There were the intercessors of Squad Agalno, who formed the backbone of the force, and the assault intercessors of Squad Gabrius, youthful hotheads hand-picked by Lieutenant Leodas himself. The Blade Guard of Squad Aurelian, meanwhile, were sworn to the stoic defence of Brother Donas, and they had vowed to shield the sanguinary priest wherever he undertook his sacred duties. Aggressor Squad Dantos and Eradicator Squad Enzos provided the strike force's heavy firepower. The former went about their duties with a ferocity that raised eyebrows amongst their commanders, whilst the latter were infamous for their gallows sense of humour and the ruthless artistry with which they plied their weapons. The strike force was completed by Scout Squad Gatello, whose grizzled sergeant had a reputation for turning out bands of accomplished but bloodthirsty swordsmen. This then was the questing band who took ship aboard the swift frigate Star of Dawn and set off to discover the secrets of the Arks of Omen. They faced a dark and dangerous mission, and as yet had little idea how they might complete it. Yet they were a potent force of expert warriors. If anyone could fulfill the duty appointed to them, it was the Battle Brothers of Strike Force Rallian. The Road to Enlightenment. After taking counsel with his officers to garner suggestions for how the quest should proceed, Rallian first had the Star of Dawn make warp for the Gaigos system. Rumour had it a Baal fleet had been sighted bearing down on the shrine world of Pathasos. Rallian was not yet certain how to complete his mission. The Arks of Omen were vast and deadly even without taking into account their attendant Baal fleets, and one frigate stood no chance against such a foe. Yet he was not sure by what means study from afar or covert infiltration could be effected, or whether they would prove sufficient. However, in Rallian's experience, opportunities presented themselves to the proactive. He hoped that, by trailing their quarry and watching for an opening, the Blood Angels would see a way forward in their quest. He was also conscious that, in an era as dark as this, the might of the Blood Angels was sorely needed all across the Imperium. They could not afford to waste more time than they must, even in a duty as vital as this. By the time Star of Dawn translated into the Gygos system, the Ark and its fleet had wrought havoc and moved on. The Blood Angels bore witness to the horrors left in the heretics' wake. Slain void ships guttered amidst the darkness. Vox channels rang with laments for the countless dead, while shrine cities and defense platforms burned. Rallian brought his force into orbit above ravaged Pathasos, but it soon became clear that there was little to be learned here. The foe had bombarded the planet's defensive bastions before launching a planet-wide invasion, during which countless relics and precious tomes had been stolen. Any, or perhaps none, might have been the prizes sought by this Ark of Omen. It was impossible to tell. The Blood Angels deployed to Pathasos' surface nonetheless, for heretic forces yet remained left behind by their Baal fleet. Any hope that a knowledgeable victim could be snatched for interrogation soon evaporated, however. The traitors that remained on the Shrine World were dregs, fanatical cultists and renegades who had descended into barbarism, madness, or mindless mutation. Knowing they could not put aside their duty to aid the planet's scattered defenders, Strikeforce Rallian departed Pathasos and the Gygos system with heavy hearts. Trials and disappointments followed. The Baal fleets were not attacking en masse, but were rather scattered across vast galactic gulfs, even as travel and communication were catastrophically hamstrung by the turbulence of the warp. It took Strikeforce Rallian many weeks to detect each lead they were able to find, and longer still to chase down what often proved to be phantasmal or long-departed quarry. Reports of a Baal fleet attacking the Valmor belt turned out to be mistaken, and brought the strike force into an ill-matched conflict with kin of the Kronos hegemony. The Blood Angels retreated rather than risk needless annihilation. The next report of the beast in Scarlet Baal fleet assailing the Thenite worlds proved accurate. The Blood Angels found their quarry locked in a ferocious void battle with the Necron fleet. The Star of Dawn closed to scanning range. Rallian hoped to study the beast in Scarlet, while the Ark's masters were distracted and embattled. However, by the time the frigate was forced to disengage by Necron tomb ships, it had become clear that external energy spectra could tell the Blood Angels little. They would likely have to get aboard an Ark if they wished to learn more. Rallian was not willing to risk lives in a boarding action without a far clearer plan of what they should do once aboard their target Ark. It was not enough to fight their way to the warp portal and hope for insights once they reached it. The time had come to call upon the aid of an old honor brother whom Rallian had not seen in almost half a century. Battered but unbowed, the Star of Dawn turned its prow towards distant Istroma, homeworld of the Tome Keeper's chapter. Codicia Bakir. Taciturn and somber, Brother Bakir is a solitary soul within the Tome Keeper's chapter, and something of an enigma to his battle brothers. Noble born into the ranks of House Maru, it is rumored that he entered the Trial of Pages, the Tome Keeper's selection process for new aspirants, voluntarily, rather than take up his duties as the head of his family. Bakir has never talked about his past, nor have his fellow librarians ever gleaned anything from him, for he is a master of obfuscation, misdirection, and illusion. While these psychic talents have proven useful in many theatres of war, particularly in service to Vanguard strike forces, Bakir's greatest strength lies in his study of warp portals and the manipulation of imperial tides. He has devoted much of his time over his 2 centuries of service to seeking an understanding of these phenomena, and it was his dire warnings that saw the Tome Keeper's first company redeploy to the Cadian Gate just before Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade poured from it. The Rite of Echoes. Epistori Rallian at last enjoyed good fortune in achieving a swift and safe warp transit to Istruma. Moreover, upon arriving at the solemn world, he found the battle brother he sought cloistered away amidst the Tome Keeper's endless libraries. Rallian experienced a quietly joyous reunion with Codicia Bacchia before the two librarians turned to more serious matters. To Rallian's surprise, he found the insightful Bacchia was already studying the very problem with which he wrestled, albeit from a different starting point. The Tome Keepers had their own closely guarded means of garnering information from across the war-torn galaxy, and it had long been habit between Rallian and Bacchia that they not pry into their respective chapters' secrets. Rallian accepted at face value the Codicia's revelation that he had been able to piece together fragments of multiple after-action reports and distress calls from war zones where the Arks of Omen had attacked. Bacchia had noted references, however tangential or brief, to the warp portals that every Ark of Omen seemed to possess. There were more data points the Codicia had compiled and correlated that steadily firmed up his conclusions. But time was pressing, and Rallian was willing to take his honor brother's assertions on trust. It was enough to note that Bacchia, like the Blood Angels, had concluded that understanding the portals and their purpose could be key to defeating the Arks of Omen. What Rallian had hoped, and Bacchia now confirmed, was that the learned Codicia had plumbed his chapter's most restricted books of lore and discovered a potential solution to their problem. It was a psychic ritual Bacchia called the Rite of Echoes. Combining his extensive studies of empiric portals and real space entanglements with insights from scholars dating back to pre-imperial times, he described the rite to Rallian as dropping a stone down a well and listening to its echoes in order to determine the depth of the well and the destination point of the stone. Of course, this undertaking was infinitely more complex and perilous. Their well, Bacchia observed, was likely an entire labyrinth of tunnels all emptying out into other wells and infested with malevolent entities who did not take kindly to the dropping of stones. When Rallian expressed concern at the risks involved, Bacchia laughed bleakly. He had not yet been able to attempt his ritual, he explained, but his chapter master had refused point-blank the Codicia's request for a strike force to help him. This was because the rite could only be conducted in the presence of an active and fully awakened warp portal, and such a thing could only be found aboard or attached to a battle-ready and operational Ark of Omen. It was, in short, a virtual suicide mission, which the understrength and far-scattered Tome Keepers could not afford. Now, though, with the aid of Strikeforce Rallian, Bacchia believed there might be a chance, albeit not for a headlong assault. However, Rallian's warriors, supplemented with whatever battle brothers Bacchia could call upon, represented a formidable enough force that they might board a damaged or embattled Ark while its defenders' attention was turned to wider conflict. Then, moving swiftly and accepting that steep casualties were likely, they could push to the site of the warp portal, conduct their ritual, and pull out before the scattered defenders of the colossal Ark could fully mobilize. Returning by whatever means to the Star of Dawn, provided the frigate had been able to evade the guns of the foe, the survivors of the strike force would escape with the vital knowledge they had gained. It was a desperate plan, and the librarians debated its necessity and nuances for long hours. In the end, they agreed that the Emperor's Angels had been built for such odds as these, and that the ends justified the risks. Moreover, Bacchia confided that he knew where they might begin their hunt, provided they moved quickly. Word had reached the Tome Keepers of an attack upon a deep void astropathic relay station in the same subsector as Istruma. The assault had been conducted by a Bale fleet, and at its head sailed the vast and malevolent ark known as the Herald of Misery. Opportunistic obliteration. Warpsmith Czagra stood immobile as the rings of the umbilical boarding conduit pulsated around him. Magnetic talons in the boots of his Terminator armor gripped the umbilical's biomechanical inner surface. The Herald of Misery's gravity tugged at the Warsmith as the vermian conduit snaked towards the doomed station before it. At Czagra's shoulder stood Carball Mandrax, his master of executions, and Vernok the Grey. Dozens of Vernok's elite bronze-wrought veterans stood in ordered ranks behind them. In front of the Warsmith, clinging to barbed excrusions that lined the conduit, mobs of cultists strove to maintain their positions. Throngs of the Riven-reforged cult had been given the honor of forging the Warpsmith's path of conquest into the deep space station. Czagra heard them wheeze in the thin air, burdened, he knew, under the weight of detritus, sparking machine parts and corroded bionics. He did not deign to lay his eyes upon them. They were fodder to absorb the firepower of the station's defenders, nothing more. "What is the plan, Warsmith?" asked Vernok. Flickering lumen encrusted the board conduit's curved surface, some with the staring, lamp-like eyes of scuttling demonic automata, but they reflected only dully from Vernok's scorched and abraded armor. "Mecrantir's conclave have augured that this station's wardens hoard a cache of soul-blight witches. They will be of great use as sacrifices to secure the Dark God's power. Better that than feeding the Maggot Lord of Terror. We breach their bulkheads. We crush their fire points. We find where they keep their witches. Once they are mine, the station will feel my wrath in full. They will be naught but dust for any that come looking for it." Mandrax stirred at Vernok's side, and temporary lucidity resurfacing from the depths of his mind. "Abaddon's prize," he grunted, "will not be forgotten," Czagra replied sternly. "We do not veer from the Despoiler's goal. Yet, while the Ark-slave psychers sniff out our next point of translation to reach it, I will not ignore this bastion of Imperial arrogance. Not when it dares to exist." With violent tremors that threatened to dislodge the cultists, the umbilical climbed onto the outer hull of the astropathic relay station. Its armor was strong, fortified with the greatest technologies the Adeptus Astra Telepathica could demand. Yet still, its metallic skin was pierced by the Moor engines that ringed the Herald of Misery's boarding tendrils. A shriek of tortured metal and the howl of equalizing pressure echoed through the umbilical, before an aperture in front of the cultists irised open. Showers of sparks lit up the invaders. Czagra gave a dismissive gesture, and the cultists swarmed into the station with shouted curses. Czagra strode through the breach, his warriors forming up around him. Warning klaxons blared. Smoke belched from out-of-control fires. Detonations and the creak of the installation's compromised structure sounded from distant sections. Over it all was laid the sounds of battle, made deafeningly loud in the confined corridors. Solid slugs whirred like startled game from the smoke-filled passage as Czagra barged down it. Ricochets sparked from bulkheads and his armor. His predator's gaze caught glimpses of Imperial defenders amidst the smoke. They wore black tunics under crimson armor and ornately crested helmets that carried the sigil of an eye. The high-powered lasguns that they bore connected to bulky targeters that covered their visors like mechanical veils. Czagra reached the first of his mortal cannon fodder. Dead and dying cultists crunched under his tread. Supplicatory shrieks cut off as his boots popped rib cages. The main passageway widened, and Vernok led several of the bronze-wroughts chosen ahead. Mandrax and bronze-wrought Terminators took up positions at the Warsmith's flank, advancing alongside him in an impregnable phalanx. "Find the witches!" Czagra demanded. Vernok signaled his assent with a blurt of encrypted vox screech, taking his chosen down a corridor to the left, where they were swallowed up in darkness and noise. The Grand Marshal of Ruin paused momentarily to examine every component of his assault. Visions flickered in his mind and his helmet's display. Streams of data flowed between the flesh of his brain and a clutch of techno-demonic chatterlings that slunk in his shadow. He absorbed the feeds from Iron Warriors penetrating the station via other boarding assaults. Desperate, uninformed mortals falling back from them with lasguns blazing. He monitored the Void War, his capital ships systematically wrecking the station's defending vessels. Some attempted to flee. Czagra directed his escorts to hunt them down before they could escape. The Warpsmith returned his focus to the pathetic attempts at resistance ahead. He would not dignify their stand as a defense. Heavier weaponry had belatedly been brought to bear by the defenders ahead. Heavy bolter shells tore gouges in the deck plates, and a searing lance cannon beam crippled one of his Terminator bodyguards. Czagra picked out a rough barricade stretched across the corridor's width. In an instant, he crafted efficient firing solutions to murder the heavy weapons teams he could see reloading behind it, transmitting the information to his bronze root with thought. Czagra increased his pace, the Terminators following his lead. They fired without pause. Cultists went down beneath the Iron Warriors' trampling advance. Some had time to see their lord bearing down on them. Their shouts turned to screams of panic. In a maddening rush, those still alive swarmed the defenders' barricades. By the time Czagra reached the defenders' lines, the corridor shook with the vibration of his charge, and he smashed through the barricade with ease. Debris, weapon cartridges, and flesh burst before his impact. Mandrax screamed incoherently with every swing of his massive axe into the dark-clad defenders. Czagra grabbed a slab of metal with his claw and flung it at a press of soldiers, the improvised projectile bisecting or decapitating half a squad. "Die!" he roared. The slaughter lasted seconds. Fire blackened and gore spattered. Czagra drove deeper into the relay station, the frailty and death behind him already forgotten. Dozens more loyalist soldiers died as Czagra followed Vernok's transmitted trail. Gun nests burned, gantries dripped with blood. His passage a trail of destruction that wound into the station's guts. "Speak," Czagra demanded as he approached Vernok. The Warpsmith sub-commander gestured to an august-shrined console, tearing its dead operator from her data port connections before replying. "Warpsmith, we have secured cogitator access. It can direct you to your new assets." Czagra's techno-demonic thralls chittered as he dug his bronze talons into the console's innards. Fibrous weaves of cable and sinew writhed over the gauntlet, worming into data ports. His chatterlings extended metal-sheathed pseudopods and clacking receptors that burrowed into the console. The station's machine spirits were powerful, blessed with aggressive data savior protocols to purge invasion subroutines. They were not enough. They screeched and died as Czagra plundered the cogitator's secrets. The Warpsmith wrenched his claw free, his mind alight with stolen data. He transmitted the coordinates to his other boarding parties, commanding them to meet him there. "I have them," he told Vernok. "Follow me." Another 14 minutes of bloody battle saw Czagra and his followers at last storming down a final corridor towards the station's holding pens. There, Czagra knew he would find the witches that Mecrantir's quantum foretellings had revealed. Only a single hatchway now stood between the Warpsmith and his prize, embedded in a sigil-warded bulkhead and protected by a mass of hostile soldiers, fortified weapons turrets, and armored servitors. The speed of the Iron Warriors' assault caught the Vault Guardians off guard, servo turrets slow to focus their targeting reticules. A squad of chosen bronze-wrought reached the front lines of uniformed soldiers sooner than they could raise their ornate rifles. A score of them were butchered before the chosen fell to concentrated firepower. The disruption and carnage they created was enough for Czagra to funnel his remaining bronze-wrought in, however. With growls and embittered roars blasting from their vox emitters, the Iron Warriors attacked in a broad wedge, with Czagra at its burgeoning tip. Bolt shells, melter beams, plasma blasts, and streams of solid shot heralded their attack, gouging bloody chunks from the defenders. The Warpsmith fired his arcane combi bolter, blast waves of screaming spirits, throwing soldiers into the air, a moment before he reached the survivors and carved them apart with brutal sweeps of his cursed augmetic claw. The loyalist defenders buckled, but held. Servo turrets at last found their mark. Searing energy beams, heavy caliber shells, and armored-piercing missiles scythed into iron warriors and defenders both. Arcs of crackling warp energy suddenly erupted from amongst the defenders' lines, incinerating iron warriors not 6 feet from Czagra. The Warpsmith smiled grimly as he killed. The astropathic relay's masters had been driven out to defend their secret vault, as he'd known they would. The battle-hardened Psyker's presence was their desperation made manifest. He counted 2, no, 3, at this end of the line, even as the robed figures visibly braced themselves to gather more empiric energy. Czagra saw a bulky blur whip past him. The Master of Execution's first blow cleaved through the Psyker's skull, chest and hip, biting several inches into blood-soaked deck plates. Mandrax's head snapped around to face the next, his mismatched bionic eyes seeking out his prey's souls and analyzing its every weakness before he stormed the terrified Psyker. A pair of detonations marked the deaths of 2 servo turrets, the explosions scything through the soldiers sheltering behind them. Driven into the open, the last handful of loyalists were gunned down in short order, their corpses flung sprawling against the very hatch that they tried to defend. Czagra's gimlet scrutiny fell upon a surviving Primaris Psyker, cowering at bay beneath his warrior's guns. The Warpsmith's lips curled cruelly. The Primaris Psyker squirmed in pain and, Czagra hoped, in spiritual anguish. The Warpsmith's monstrous talons easily wrapped around the thin body. His bronze-wrought ended lives, searching out the merely wounded to extend the murderous rampage as long as possible. Some paced like caged beasts, or vented their unsated anger on twitching corpses. Mandrax stood gazing at nothing, awaiting his master's command to kill. Czagra's attention was drawn back to the Psyker in his palm as it tried to speak. "A last curse, fool?" he asked the woman. "Death," she croaked, coughing blood and heaving a breath. "Death is all you will find behind that door. You're a fool if you think we hid some ancient treasure here. It is a prison, not a vault. These are not Psykers who can serve anyone, least of all a traitor. I thank the Golden Throne that they will at least benefit the Emperor when you unleash them, by tearing your soul apart. They are dangerous degenerates, wild and uncontrolled, empiric cataclysms waiting to happen." She gasped once as Czagra slowly closed his claw. The Warpsmith's whispered growl was the last thing she heard. "This is exactly what I need." The Invasion of Lume 4. Warpsmith Czagra's slave Psykers led him to the troubled shrine world of Lume 4. Czagra wasted no time in unleashing the might of the Herald of Misery's Bale fleet upon its shocked Imperial defenders. The Lume system had once been prosperous before a long-forgotten cataclysm ended its good fortune, destroying all but 3 of the system's planets and littering the void with dust nebulae and strange gravitic anomalies. The surviving Imperial worlds had struggled on in comparative isolation, each damaged in its own way. The hive world of Lume 2 orbited close to the system's star, and was forced to hide its cities beneath thermo-reflective domes that gleamed like blisters amidst the scorched landscape. Lume 9 was a mining world, whose self-replicating crystal deposits had burst the planet from within. Mining rigs and platforms still clung to the shattered world like parasites, and continued to harvest its rampant mineral bounty. Lume 4, meanwhile, was a shrine world that, due to ancient administrative errors, the ecclesiarchy were forced to share with a substantial presence from the Forge world of Metallica. The Shrine world's despairing governors strove to keep peace between the intermingled power blocks of the two faiths. But Lume 4 had been riven for centuries with politicking and sporadic civil wars. If this situation had a silver lining, it was that the planet's forge and shrine sprawls were heavily fortified. Lume 4 also boasted 4 massive orbital defense platforms: sword, hammer, glaive, and dagger, crewed by the Imperial Navy. These garrisons rotated regularly from the system's deep void station, Leona Stellarium, which also supported a fleet of warships charged with patrolling the local subsector and intercepting pirates and raiders. The Bale Fleet descends. The Herald of Misery Bale Fleet appeared with sudden and frightening precision within the bounds of the Lume system. In part, this was thanks to the supernatural abilities of the Ark's demonic ferryman and the guidance offered to its fleet by the blazing beacon of the Obeliskane. It was also likely aided by a judicious sacrifice of psychers offered by Czagra to the dark gods while en route. Not only was the Bale Fleet's dispersal tight and coherent, but the timing of its arrival was fortuitous. Half the local defense fleet had departed days earlier to drive off an Orc invasion of the Forvosa Belt, leaving Imperial Navy forces thin in the void. With characteristic swiftness, Czagra formulated his attack plan and set his warbands in motion. The warships of the Ferrocrete Creed he sent to intercept a Navis Imperialis patrol group near Lume 2, while Void War specialists, including the Chromite Beasts, the Savagers, and many of Czagra's own capital ships, sped eagerly towards Leona Stellarium to capture or destroy the Void Fort. A third, smaller raiding party under Dark Magos Brugos swept away towards distant Lume 9 with orders to ransack the mining operation. The Bale Fleet's remaining strength, largely troop transports, bulk landers, and colossal Titan conveyors, as well as a few lumbering bombardment barges, powered on towards Lume 4, following the psychic spoor of their allotted key fragment. Thanks to the sorcerer Mekrantir, Czagra was apprised of the limitations of the slave psychers Abaddon had provided. In order to zero in on the location of the key fragment, he would have to land forces on Lume 4 and commence methodical ground sweeps. Such a plan suited Czagra's meticulous nature and fed into his desire to grind this world's loyalist defenders slowly beneath his heel. As he confided to Vernok the Grey, it will also give him a chance to test the capabilities of his titanic new flagship and ensure the Despoiler's gift was truly all that had been promised. The Herald Unleashed. As Czagra's battle fleet neared Lume 4, it subdivided, opening out like a gauntlet to grasp its target world. Void besiegement groups made for the planet's 4 defense platforms, surrounding sword, hammer, glaive, and dagger, and tying up their guns. The Herald of Misery settled into orbit like some malign moon, and commenced systematically bombarding the world's anti-orbital defense emplacements. Czagra made no attempt to evade their return fire. He expected the Herald of Misery to prove its resilience to him, and to bludgeon the Loyalist into ruin in return. The colossal vessel did not disappoint. As its cold shadow spread eclipse-like across Sprawl Hallowdale, the Ark rained destruction. The atmospheric carronades of St. Faustin's Cloister were obliterated in a storm of plasma. The ornate dome Divinicus was staved in by barrage bombs, its laser batteries reduced to blazing wreckage. Alarm bells tolled from the 22 towers of the Cathedral of the Emperor Wrathful, as salvos of blessed missiles howled up from its weapon crypts to rake the underbelly of the Ark. Yet cries of rapture turned to wails of despair atop the cathedral's ramparts as the Herald of Misery returned fire with energy beams and trans-atmospheric deflagrators. The resultant explosive demise of the Cathedral of the Emperor Wrathful could be seen 100 miles away. Standing within a scrying sanctum aboard the Herald of Misery, Czagra watched flaming devastation spread before his vessel. Runic feeds and vet captures showed waves of landing craft descending into the zones of devastation wrought by their Ark, seizing landing zones virtually unopposed. The landers' point guns spotted Imperial fighter craft from the skies as they rumbled down through the atmosphere to begin the ground offensive. As the Herald of Misery carved a path through the sprawl Hallowdale and on into the neighbouring sprawl Phi Octus Prime, huge warbands of Barbican lords, oppressors, and Forge Moor's iron warriors deployed almost unopposed in its wake. Landing craft the size of Habstacks disgorged titans of the Legios, Krytos, and Rorgal to reinforce them. The discordant bray of war horns rolled across battered cityscapes, causing defenders to quail in fear. Still, hosts of Adeptus Sororitas and Skitarii converged upon the heretic landing zones as they brought every weapon to bear against the invaders. The land war had begun. Spreading flames. Much of the continental landmass of Talovent fell to the Iron Warriors in the first 5 days, allowing traitor hosts to push into the Seven Stacks region and across the land bridge onto the Qualdam Plains. Though each individually fought well, the armies of the Adeptus Sororitas and Adeptus Mechanicus could not overcome their mutual mistrust and so failed to unify in all but the most extreme circumstances. Waves of cultists and militarum traitores overran the Aethernon bastion, even as the Skitarii of Marshal Castor 5-5, who could have tipped the balance, instead withdrew to escort fleeing tech magi from a forgeplex to the north. During the siege of Foundry 9 Theta, the blessed procession of Cardinal Mashfiel circumnavigated the conflict while offering no further aid to the beleaguered Skitarii than their hymns and prayers, but these proved of little actual help. The orbital theatre, too, turned relentlessly in the Iron Warriors' favour. By the 11th day of the invasion, Dagger Platform had been entirely overrun by heretic boarding parties, and its remaining guns were turned against the planet below, while Hammer Platform had been scuttled by its defenders and was in a decaying orbit towards Lume 4's upper atmosphere. Glaive and Sword still held out, supported by the handful of loyalist warships that had managed to join the fight. They had inflicted considerable heretic casualties. They could do little to halt the ongoing rampage of the Herald of Misery. Czagra's vast flagship had absorbed everything the Loyalists could throw at it, and, while it did show outward signs of damage, its immense and jumbled superstructure seemed able to absorb infinite amounts of punishment. Czagra, for his part, left command of the individual theatres to his champions as he monitored the progress of his slave psyker handlers on the world below. With every passing hour, they closed in upon their objective. Once they found and recovered the key fragment, his duty to the Despoiler would be complete. Then, Czagra thought with relish, he would proceed with the annihilation of this world. Dawning light. While the situation worsened on Lume 4, the Star of Dawn slipped from the warp on the system's edge. Blood Angel's Liberian Valiant had the frigate lurk within a dark nebula, while readings were taken and strategic auguries performed. The doom of the Lume system swiftly became apparent. So too did an opportunity. Though the distances involved made certainty impossible, it appeared much of the Herald of Misery Bale fleet was scattered through the system in ongoing engagements. This left the Ark of Omen comparatively open to a swift boarding assault. Such an attempt was laden with risks, which were enumerated by sanguinary priest Donas and Techmarine Chalmo during the heated conference that now took place in the Star of Dawn Strategium. It would take time for the frigate to cross the Gulf of Space to reach Lume 4, during which heretic warships might detect and attack it. Even alone, the Ark possessed colossal firepower, and could make short work of the approaching frigate. If, by the blessings of their Emperor, the Space Marines made it aboard, they might be overrun or their ship destroyed before they could complete their mission. All this was true, Rallian allowed, yet they were unlikely to get a better opportunity. An approach through the system's drifting dust nebulae, and then between the screening debris of the ongoing orbital conflict, would allow them to close on their target. A lunge by their nimble frigate ought to permit them to deploy by boarding torpedoes. After this, it would be up to the Star of Dawn's crew to keep their vessel alive, while Strikeforce Rallian could achieve their mission and contrive a means to escape from the Herald of Misery ready for pickup. His plan was one only the Adeptus Astartes could possibly execute against such odds, yet more than ever, the librarian felt a dreaded presentiment of time running short. He sensed they must strike now, no matter the risks. Swayed by Rallian's conviction, his battle brothers acceded. Mere minutes after the Space Marines left the stratagem to make ready, the Star of Dawn lit its real space thrusters and began its approach towards Lume 4. Foothold. Epistolary Rallian gritted his teeth and heard his restraint harness creak under the boarding pod's punishing acceleration. Strapped in around him in the crimson-lit gloom were Tech Marine Chalmo and his servitors, the intercessors of Squad Agalno and Sergeant Dantos' aggressors. Theirs was one of 6 torpedoes launched from the bespoke, retrofitted launch tubes of the Star of Dawn. 3 of the projectiles transported the remainder of Rallian's strike force and their Tome Keepers' allies, while the other 2 were dummy munitions fired as ablative escorts. All streaked away from the sword-class frigate towards the mountainous flank of the Herald of Misery. Upon nearing Lume 4, the Star of Dawn had found the Herald of Misery still unaccompanied. The frigate's crew had approached the Ark of Omen under the cover of a wreckage belt that tumbled in the wake of a dying orbital defense platform. It had been a feat of astrogation to weave between the huge chunks of drifting wreckage and sparkling debris without being struck, but the nimble Star of Dawn had proven equal to the task. Like an ambush hunter, the warship had waited as the Herald of Misery's course brought it steadily closer, then pounced. Now Rallian could hear the Star of Dawn's shipmaster and his crew exchanging clipped words over the Voxnet as they and the Space Marines endured the most perilous moments of the attack run. Rallian and his battle brothers faced a gauntlet of point-blank fire before the thunderous impact with the Ark of Omen's hull. For the Star of Dawn, there was a swift dive through the Herald of Misery's fire zones, then a hard burn to escape the huge vessel's clutches. Even while enduring G-forces that would have killed an unaugmented human, the librarian monitored his Vox and vid feeds with fierce intensity. "This so-called Ark is an abomination," Vox Sergeant Agalno. "That it is, brother," Rallian replied. "A truly monstrous thing." He watched the colossal warship grow to fill the torpedo's forward vid feeds. It felt like racing towards a fortified mountain range. The Ark's hide was a patchwork of human and Xenos engineering, mingled randomly with disturbing biomechanical extrusions. He saw a forest of archaic towers protruding from a region of overlapping metal and stone, ghostly aurorae dancing between their tips. He noted what appeared to be a localized storm system raging around an alien-made dome in defiance of the void and reason both. Cradles of scaffold rose in many places, new defensive structures gestating within them that bore all the hallmarks of Iron Warrior's construction. Uncountable lights studded the macro vessel's hull. Some doubtless indicated occupied regions of the vessel, Rallian thought, or external systems at work. Many others were clearly weapons emplacements, even now spitting streams of fire that could spell doom for the strike force before its mission even began. As though their machine spirit shared his misgivings, the boarding torpedoes piled on speed, commenced evasive maneuvers, and jettisoned clouds of electro-chaff. Projectiles whipped soundlessly past them in the airless void, but none found their mark. "The Iron Warriors may believe they excel in raising their heretical fortifications, but they are far from adept at defending them," voxed Lieutenant Leodus. His arch observation raised chuckles from a number of the Space Marines. These were silenced in the next instant, as a Cyclopean energy cannon on the Ark's hull spat a furious crimson blast. The mere radiation burst released by its firing caused the vid feeds to white out and drown the Vox in static. "Throne of Terror," cursed Sergeant Dantos. Their torpedo shuddered violently. Its lumen flickered. Only half the vid feeds returned to functionality. Voices rose gradually from the hissing static morass of the Voxnet. The bridge crew of the Star of Dawn sounding like ghosts in Rallian's earbead. "Hey again, this is Star of Dawn. Heretic energy cannon fire evaded. No damage to... of Dawn. One dummy torpedo lost. No damage. Occupy projectiles. Bring her about, Mr. Fowl, and put us beyond that monsters. Alert. Energy cannon fire. Into the debris field. I don't know what hit, Lord, but energy readings are spiking off the scale. Holy Throne. Destabilizing plasma reactor. Get us clear of the blast zone now. Readings critical. Emergency prayers." Rallian scowled as, on the rearward vid feed, a newborn star bloomed amidst the debris belt. He saw the plasmic shockwave roll outwards, vaporizing everything in its path. Though the ship was now small and distant, he saw the moment its battered void shields flared out under the ferocious bombardment. The plasma star dissipated, but not swiftly enough for the Star of Dawn, which listed off course, obviously crippled. "Sanguinius preserve them!" cried sanguinary priest Donas. His exhortation went unanswered. The ferocious crimson beam reached out from the Herald of Misery for a second time and, though the torpedo's external feeds were banished by its energy wash, there could be no doubt as to the warship's fate. "Impact in 5 seconds, called Chalmo. Rallian just had time to brace himself before their torpedo fired retro rockets, then struck the hull of the Ark like a thunderbolt. The shock of impact was redoubled for the epistolary as the death agonies of the Star of Dawn crew battered him. Grav baffles engaged and harnesses flexed, helping the Space Marines weather the colossal deceleration. Flashing rune panels indicated the torpedo's melter torches had engaged, and a depth readout showed its progress as it burrowed like a parasite into the Ark of Omen's hide. The torpedo shuddered violently. The screech of metal sounded dimly through its hull. "Voxnet quiescence. Contact with other torpedoes lost. Probable cause, hull density coupled with vocalized anomalous radiation," reported Chalmo in his signature monotone. "I am maintaining scans on all frequencies. Will reacquire at earliest opportunity." "Prepare yourselves, brothers," said Rallian. "This is now also a mission of vengeance for those aboard the Star of Dawn." The torpedo jolted violently. There came a vertiginous lurch of falling, then another even harder impact. Stillness followed. Through the hull came a muffled cacophony of gunfire and shouts that Rallian knew all too well. "Release!" ordered the librarian, punching his harnesses, unlocking rune and rising. A somber chime rolled through the torpedo's transport compartment, followed by the hard bangs of locking bolts disengaging. The prow of the torpedo blasted clear to emit harsh light, whirling smoke, and the din of bolter and autogun fire. "Advance and engage," Rallian ordered, as he led his battle brothers out of the boarding torpedo. "For the Emperor and Sanguinius!" roared Sergeant Dantos, as he and his aggressors flanked right. "Death to the heretics!" barked Sergeant Argalno, leading his intercessors out on Rallian's left flank. The librarian himself strode up the center with Carminius drawn. The chamber was cavernous, its walls and ceiling a scabrous tangle of cabling and rusted metal that had been methodically reinforced with riveted girders painted with hazard stripes. Rallian noted the crisscrossing network of conveyor belts, cranes, and strange flesh-metal machines crowding the space, and the mountains of cargo containers and munitions stacked between them. More pressing, however, was the battle raging before him. Rallian's torpedo had punched through close to Lieutenant Leodis's, who had already led the warriors of Assault Intercessor Squad Gabrius and Eradicator Squad Enzos into battle. They fought Chaos cultists who had massed to meet the Blood Angels' incursion. These were ragged figures, most of whom wore crude iron masks and whose bodies were deformed by clumsy bionics. Many cultists already lay dead, hacked and blasted by the advancing Blood Angels. More were pouring in between the machinery and container stacks to join the fight. "To the lieutenant!" Rallian ordered. He sent a bolt of psychic energy lashing out to boil the blood of a half-dozen cultists. The heretics gave bubbling screams and dropped, steaming, to the deck. Squad Galno's bolt rifles boomed, blowing apart cultists with every shot, even as jets of fire belched from Squad Dantos's flame-storm gauntlets to engulf more of the luckless heretics. Like a wounded beast, the mass of cultists recoiled from this fresh assault and, as Leodis and his brothers continued to carve through their ranks, began to waver. "Reacquisition ritual successful," reported Brother Chalmo. "Audiobook and his brothers establishing secondary bridgehead 370 yards localized south of our position. Same deck level. Sanguinary Priest Donas's torpedo experienced minor course deviation. Impact 842 yards to localized north of our position, and estimate one deck structure above ours. I am reinitializing box choristry and plotting optimal rendezvous coordinates. X-loading to Strike Force Tactical Manifold." As the Tech Marine made his report, Rallian and his brothers struck the enemy lines with vengeful fury. The librarian hacked and hewed with Carminius, leaving bodies dismembered in his wake. Dantos's aggressors bludgeoned their foes into pulp and reduced more than a score to fire-blackened corpses in less than a minute. Unable to withstand the Blood Angels' onslaught, and with no sign of their Iron Warrior masters to bolster their courage, the cultists broke and ran. Some attempted a fighting retreat, but a few well-placed bolt shells shattered their resistance and turned flight to rout. As suddenly as it had begun, the battle was over. The Blood Angels held their positions, reloading their weapons and mustering benedictions to their machine spirits. Rallian was pleased to see his warriors had suffered no more than a few minor wounds while securing their bridgehead. He hoped the rest of their force had fared as well. With a twitch of his psychic abilities, Rallian reached out to Audiobook. "How do you fare?" "We have driven off initial resistance, but Sergeant Itana assures me further foes are massing," the Tomekeeper's librarian replied. "We are coming to you. I am sorry for the loss of your ship." "There will be time later to honor that sacrifice," thought St. Rallian. "For now, we must determine a new extraction plan." "I will seek possibilities, brother. In the meantime, what is your will? This is your command, after all." "We regroup and press forward," replied Rallian. "You and I will bend our powers to locate the warp portal, and then we seize the information we came for." "As simple as that?" asked Bakir, a wry savour to his sending. "Emperor willing, brother," said Rallian, before withdrawing from his brother librarian's mind. As he contemplated the vast and hostile labyrinth of the Herald of Misery spreading out before them, and the odds ranged against his small force, he found himself doubting that any part of this mission would be simple at all. Part 4. A Desperate Gambit. Vernok the Grey strode through the Herald of Misery. He carried the demon blade, Akgor, its bloodthirsty whispers haunting his mind. At his back marched a band of bronze-wrought terminators, all marked, as he was the sigil of Warpsmith Czagra, Grand Marshal of Ruin. This was but one of 13 hunting parties, mostly under Vernok's command, closing like a barbed net around the invaders who profaned the Warpsmith's Ark of Omen. Between them, Vernok knew his warriors possessed the strength to lay waste to armies, cities, and perhaps worlds. "So why," he muttered, "am I disquieted?" If Vernok were wholly honest with himself, he knew the answer to this question. Much like his master, he despised unknowns, and too much remained uncertain about this foe. He checked his helm's chrono. The invaders had been aboard the Herald of Misery for almost 16 hours. In that time, the Loyalists had passed through territories ruled by several of Czagra's minor champions. They had reaped a tally of helm-splitters, cutworms, while escaping the clattering hordes, descended the hollow ways into dark bleakerage, and emerged unbowed, dared the monsters hunting through the wreck of the Magdalena, survived the hellish bio-furnaces ruled by Thakor the Immolator, and seen off the attack of the Sapper Drake's warband. Reports suggested the invaders had bled for their efforts, but Vernok could not fault their cunning, speed, and tenacity. When the Loyalists had first boarded his ark, Czagra told Vernok he believed them the advance guard of some larger assault, or perhaps a diversionary force sent to leave him off balance when the two strike came. Privately, Vernok had remained skeptical. For a force of more than 50 Loyalist Space Marines was a potent army in its own right. He knew, though, that Czagra was consumed with masterminding their campaign on the planet below, and that the Warsmith expected his underlings and the malevolent perils of the Ark itself to be capable of putting page to the invaders without his having to involve himself. Thus, Vernok had kept his counsel to himself, as the boarders cut their way through a number of lesser warbands and pushed deeper into the Ark. It was when the invaders' course stopped meandering and became as straight as a lance beam pushed upwards into the Ark's spinal labyrinth that Czagra's attitude changed. It seemed unlikely now that any reinforcements were coming to aid the boarding party, for surely they would have struck by this point. Nor did it seem probable anymore that they were a mere distraction. The change of direction implied the boarders had a target, and had now determined its whereabouts. Had they come as saboteurs, as assassins? Had they learned of the task Abaddon had set Czagra and sought to foil it? Did they bear some apocalyptic weapon with which they hoped to slay the Herald of Misery? Perhaps a vortex warhead, or vials of life-eater virus? Whatever the truth, Czagra was no longer content to leave the Loyalists to be worn down or captured. Coldly enraged at this ongoing distraction, the Warsmith ordered them crushed without further delay, and entrusted Vernok with the task. "They enter the screaming decks," reported Carball Mandrax over Vernok's helm vox. The Axeman commanded a party of Iron Warriors and cultists, and had been charged with pressuring the Loyalists' flanks and forcing them into Vernok's planned kill box. "They have passed through the 19th Rune Gate," reported Barakor, a champion commanding another of Vernok's hunting parties. "Make them climb," Vernok responded. "Do not permit them to flee to the Beast Pit, or break out towards the Neon Clysters." "As you command, Lord," said Barakor, the boom of boltfire underpinning his words. "We hold firm. We have iron within. We are driving them up the third stair." Runes blinked on Vernok's helm auspex, showing him the approximate positions of his forces and those of the foe on a flickering tri-dimensional map. He doubted its accuracy, for the Herald of Misery writhed and contorted when left unobserved, and the storm of radiation flowing from the vast vessel fouled all but the most hardened systems. Still, the map served for general positioning. Looking at it now, Vernok could see that if they did not hurry, he and his warriors might arrive too late to join the slaughter. He quickened his pace, climbing a rusting stairway and passing through a yawning bulkhead that had sprouted fangs and eyes. "Sektha, are your warsmiths ready?" he voxed. The voice that answered was a flat snarl laced with scrap code static. "Confirm. The Coven stands conjoined. We are one with the engine geists that can trigger the barrier emitters at will." "Then enact phase primers," commanded Vernok. On his map, Vernok saw crimson lines spreading up across doorways and corridors. The runes beside them denoted barrier force fields, perhaps once the atmospheric lockdown systems or whatever mangled vessels made up the screaming decks, triggered by the Warsmiths interfacing with local control consoles. These fields now formed impenetrable barriers that would herd the Loyalists into Vernok's trap. The designator runes indicated the intruders halted, as though the foe knew they were being herded and were casting about for any alternative path. Accelerating to a jog, Vernok led his warriors up a spiralling metal ramp whose low ceiling was festooned with leaking cables and sparking wires. "Haste! We close on them!" he barked at his warriors, whose Terminator plate made them slower and more lumbering than himself. After another few turns on the ramp and a brass blast door, the din of gunfire and war cries finally washed over Vernok. Beyond the door lay a steeply canted chamber that must once have been part of some Xenos craft. Fluids had run from its blister-like consoles, hardening into resinous stalactites in which fossilized circuitry glinted. Organo-technological protrusions sprouted from the walls and floors, their purposes unclear. At the chamber's far end, its structure flowed like tallow into a human-built stairway of cavernous dimensions, fashioned with brushed metal and decorated with vox gargoyles that vomited static-laced screams. It was from this direction that the sound of battle raged. It was from here, too, that several iron warriors appeared, falling back into the alien chamber, with bolt shells whipping around them. Xenoform extrusions shattered like glass as stray shots hit them. "Stand your ground!" bellowed Vernok, furious at catching one of his blocking forces in the act of abandoning their posts. The next moment, the retreating iron warriors were raked by melter beams, their armor deforming, their bodies flash-blasting into clouds of ash and steaming gore. Their killers came into view behind them, a squad of warriors armed with bulky melter weapons and wearing the crimson armor of blood angels. Vernok and his warriors opened fire. Their shots sent one loyalist crashing backwards, half his helm blown away and his chest a cratered wreck. Alien consoles and stalactites exploded as wildfire struck them. The loyalists retreated into the stairway, and Vernok pursued. "Block this route!" he roared, his voice vox-amplified over the screaming of the gargoyles and the clatter of gunfire. "Drive them upwards!" Emerging into the stairwell, Vernok assessed the running battle at a glance. More bronze-wrought pushed up from below, guns hammering, side corridors were rendered impassable by the crimson blaze of Shekthar's barriers, or by dug-in iron warriors. The blood angels and tomb keepers, visible through the stairs' safety rails, performed a fighting retreat up to the floors above. "Sector, enact phase secundus," foxed Vernok, even as fresh force field lines bloomed on his map to drive the loyalists higher. He hailed Mandrax. "Axeman, are your warriors in place?" "Crossing Vault Bridge from the north," came Mandrax's reply. The Master of Execution sounded distracted, his breathing ragged, and Vernok knew that Mandrax would soon lose himself to murderous obsession, becoming insensible to all but slaughter. "Axeman, focus! Are your warriors in position? Have they cleared the emitters?" A pause, rasping breath through Vernok's vox bead, then half snarled. "Yes, Sector, phase tertius," ordered Vernok. Again, crimson lines flared to life on his map, and he felt cruel satisfaction as he saw the loyalists cut off at the top of the stairwell. Even now, Mandrax's warriors were hitting them from one flank, Ethrok and Ferox's from the other. Climbing the stairway amidst the whine of armoured servos, Vernok and his warriors pursued their victims into the kill box. Upon reaching the head of the stairs, Vernok saw his prey had turned to fight back. This chamber was known to the Iron Warriors as the Command Gallery, and it had once been the bridge of a warship. It boasted cogitator banks and sensor pits, and it was dominated by sweeping vid screens. Huge grotesque visages grew from its walls, wrought in brass and marble, each boasting a vox speaker more, from which issued cacophonous static screams. Had the Loyalists been able to pass through it, the command gallery offered several paths by which they might climb higher. However, they had been halted by the largest force field yet, which cut the chamber in half and presented them with a wall they could not pass. The Loyalists sought to break left or right through noisome side passages, but the warriors led by Mandrax, Ethrok and Ferox blocked these routes and were even now pressing forward to assail the beleaguered space marines. Robbed of options, the Loyalists took up a defensive stance and fought furiously. Scouts and infiltrators ducked between firing positions, maintaining a deluge of shots, while their more heavily armed battle brothers formed a firebase around their commanders. Several intruders were already down, Vernok saw, and more were wounded. Yet the Blood Angels and Tome Keepers did not look inclined to lay down their arms and surrender. Good, he thought, spinning Akgor in his hand and prowling into the fight. Then he caught the sight of a Loyalist tech marine hunched over a control panel near the chamber's heart and working with fierce intensity. The Loyalist was ringed by servitors that shielded him with their bodies, even as their heavy weapons spat fury at the Iron Warriors. "Target that tech marine," Vernok voxed. "Whatever he seeks to do, prevent him." Vernok took a shot with his combi bolter, hitting one of the lumpen servitors and blasting its innards out of its back in a gory spray. Dead-eyed and unfeeling, the servitor faltered but did not fall. Vernok snarled in disgust. Before he could fire again, a band of Blade Guard came at him with vox-amplified battle cries. They were led by a warrior who held a chalice and wore scorched robes over his power armor. Vernok's lips curled as he recognized a sanguinary priest. Bronze-wrought Terminators pressed forward around their commander, and the chosen of Warpsmith Czagra met the elite of the Loyalist boarding party blade to blade. Vernok's demon sword clashed with the howling teeth of the sanguinary priest's chainsword. Sparks burst from their impact. Roaring, Vernok heaved his foe off balance and fired his combi bolter point blank, only for a Blade Guard to block the salvo with his shield. Akgor licked out and split the warrior's faceplate. As the Blade Guard reeled, one of Vernok's Terminators ripped the Loyalist shield aside and rammed crackling talons through his armoured chest. Spitting oaths, the sanguinary priest drove his stuttering, mangled chainsword into a fanged rent in the Terminator's armour. Mauve gore erupted in a geyser from the wound, and the hulking Iron Warrior crumpled with a vox-distorted gurgle. Chanting exhortations to his outnumbered warriors, the sanguinary priest ripped his weapon from the Terminator's fallen body and hacked at Vernok's thigh, splitting cables and causing steam to vent from a ruptured exchanger. Outraged, Vernok drove Akgor deep into the priest's side. He dragged the demon blade free, blood flowing after it in a fine mist until the Loyalist Laraman's organ kicked in and clotted the blood. Vernok's decapitating backswing was parried by a Blade Guard's power sword. The master of the bronze-wrought cursed and head-butted the interfering warrior with a crash of ceramite, but the press of battle drove Vernok back, even as the wounded priest was bundled out of harm's way by his comrades. Vernok snatched a glance at the wider battle and saw that the tech marine still stood. His servitors had all been slain, but a mingled band of Tome Keepers and Blood Angels now ringed and shielded him in their place. Even Mandrax had been unable to hack a path through to a meddling tech marine, his onslaught blocked by the swift-bladed Blood Angel's lieutenant and a librarian armed with a glowing sword. "Bring him down!" roared Vernok, certain the disaster loomed. He pushed out from the ranks of his Terminators, determined to get the job done himself. If the tech marine interfered with the barrier emitters, if he was able to interrupt the wall for even a second. Vernok was confronted by a second Loyalist librarian, whose eye lenses glowed beneath a deep cowl. The warrior mystic threw up a hand in his direction, fingers crooked in a strange sigil. Vernok staggered. Sound grew muffled around him. His twin heartbeat thudded in his ears, and his vision blurred until colours flowed around him like spilled ink. He tried to fire off a volley or swing Akgor at the librarian, but his body would not obey. Vernok was suddenly faced by the possibility that he was about to be slain by warpcraft. He found himself desperate and furious at the thought, horrified by his sudden powerlessness. Then, as suddenly as they manifested, the strange phenomena abated. As Vernok's sight swam into focus, he saw that his surroundings had altered, far more so than seemed possible in the few moments he had been incapacitated. Realization dawned swiftly that it had not only been a few moments. Whatever the librarian had done to his mind, a glance at his helm chrono told Vernok his fugue state had lasted almost 3 minutes. An eon by the standards of so furious a battle. There was no sign either of the enemy nor of the force field barrier that should have kept them trapped. Distantly, Vernok could still hear the sounds of fighting, and a glance showed him all but his personal bodyguard of Terminators who pushed on in pursuit of the Loyalists. Yet the enemy had slipped the trap, and Vernok knew of a half-dozen routes they could take from here. His flickering rune map suggested the foe had split up and taken at least 2 of them, the better to avoid being trapped again. He cursed and glared around at the warriors awaiting his orders. "There will be consequences," he said. He, for one, would not wish to be Sektha or his tech coven when Czagra discovered that they had failed to prevent the tech marine from sabotaging the force field wall. "Unless you wish to feel them personally, make haste." Looking at the runes on his Auspex map, Vernok felt a growing suspicion about the Loyalist target. For once, uncertainty might have been preferable. "Contact the Warsmith," he ordered, as he strode out in pursuit of his quarry. "Warn him the intruders may be making for the warp portal. They are psychers with them more powerful than we had gleaned." Czagra frowned upon dark worship amidst his followers, but Vernok was almost tempted to offer a prayer to the dark gods. He could not conceive of the invaders destabilizing the energies of the warp portal, but if somehow they could, might such an attack see the entire Ark destroyed? He trod on a fallen Loyalist scout, his ceramite shod boot crushing the warrior's chest and ending his last hitching breaths. "These invaders will bleed for their insolence," thought Vernok. Whatever it was they sought to achieve here, he would see that they failed. The invasion of Lume 4. Many of Lume 4's anti-orbital defences had been obliterated during the initial bombardment by the Herald of Misery, allowing the heretics to make planetfall. Yet greater destruction had been planned in meticulous detail by the Arks of Omen's master, and he poured ever-increasing numbers of his Iron Warriors into the invasion. With the Shrine World's ability to inflict any appreciable damage on the Herald of Misery wiped out, the Arks of Omen could have continued to rain down destruction on sprawl after sprawl had Czagra wished. But the Warsmith was conscious of endangering the very key fragment he had come here to seize. Czagra's thorough strategy for eliminating every iota of resistance saw more heretics make planetfall on every continent. Some of them were drawn from the flotillas that had besieged the planet's 4 defense platforms, freed to be redeployed at Czagra's command, now that the platforms had been overrun. On Lume 4, his fellow champions and warriors overran isolated outposts and reduced them to burning shells, intercepted and gutted trade convoys making last-second dashes for safety, demolished habitats, defiled shrines, and breached bastions. As huge and deadly as the Herald of Misery was, it remained a single ship. Spread as they were across the face of the planet, only a few of Lume 4's densely populated sprawls suffered in the early days of the invasion. They were centers of faith, whether in the God Emperor or the Omnissiah, industrial powerhouses, pristine megalopolises of sacred import, or heavy macro-habs teeming with humanity. Some sprawls were linked to each other by webs of political and martial power, through which they offered mutual defense. However, as the war ground on, many more sprawls became isolated, and the once distant front lines scored jagged scars through their cores. The battles for Central Valenterra. Czagra's methodical surface war on Lume 4 had one primary aim: to locate the key fragment promised to Abaddon the Despoiler. At the heart of each of the War Masters' attacking armies, or following on through the ruins and butchery in their wake, groups of slave psychers sniffed out the spore of the esoteric object. It was to enable this search that his continued bombardment had so far targeted Lume 4's anti-orbital batteries. As Czagra's slave psychers trawled the areas conquered by his armies on multiple continents, A tantalizing pattern emerged in the region of central Valentera. Here, overseeing handlers reported, the spore was strong. In central Valentera's north, Sprawl Lindengrave had been reduced to ruins before any of Czagra's warbands had even set foot in it. The flaming meteor of half a system monitor, one of the world's naval defenders, had plummeted into the Sprawl's outskirts. The catastrophic impact had ravaged the Sprawl in a firestorm and buried the remnants under a new landscape of rock, plascrete, and metal. Incredibly, less than half of Lindengrave's citizens and soldiers had perished. The Sprawl was built atop a flattened, hyperdense massif, in whose honeycomb of tunnels many of the defenders had already been sheltered when the disaster struck the city. In the days that followed, Lindengrave's survivors managed to break through into the layers of debris, ruins, and steaming ejecta piled atop the massif. Through this infernal termite mound they fought the cult of the Scaranthreks and iron warriors of the Xenarth Forge Seers. Battle sisters of the Order of the Sacred Rose and of the Order of the Valorous Heart led fanatical militia, wounded Imperial Guardsmen and roaring preachers in daring guerrilla raids and counterattacks. For a day, the hidden battle lines moved back and forth, neither side able to bring enough forces to bear to overwhelm the other. This deadlock was broken when the Lord Discordant Dragorth Vaktrian discovered an entrance to the massive tunnel network. Driving packs of demon engines before him, like slavering hounds before a huntsman, Vaktrian plunged deep inside. Either trapped in the tunnels or hunted down through the wreckage mound, Lindengrave's survivors were slowly and methodically ground to extinction. To the east of Lindengrave lay Sprawl Kogor Zo Quantark, a forged sprawl under the auspices of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was host to large numbers of Skitarii war cohorts from Metallica and Styges 8, alongside battalions of Imperial Guardsmen. Faced with overwhelming heretic armor, the senior tech priest Dominus, Reclavitus Prime Grelk, sought to funnel the war engines into hidden traps and kill boxes. She marshaled the heavy firepower at her command, determined to maximize her force's kill ratio. Companies of heretic vindicators, land raiders, and super heavy artillery blasted apart Grelk's forward elements as the tanks advanced, supported by a cabal of Iron Warrior sorcerers. Chaos Titans of Legio Yitrex and traitor Knights of House Verosian ground defense lines under their iron tread as their huge cannons roared a dirge of destruction. Swifter squadrons of Chaos Predators encircled Kogorzo Quantart's lines, unleashing their heavy weaponry at vulnerable sections, like pack hunters slashing the flanks of a lumbering beast. Grelk's masterful traps were blown apart, and the combined efforts of her maniples and companies to stall the foe were crushed. In desperation, the Iron Warriors assault companies breached her rearguard. The tech priest Dominus activated an ancient hydrogyric atomizer. The supposedly forbidden explosive device spread the legendary Sanguinius Scourge, a wave of radiating flux that she was sure would reduce the heretics to radioactive slurry in their armor. Its effects on Grelk's own forces were devastating, but she had weighed their loss as acceptable to strike down the attackers. When the Scourge's particle field reached the Iron Warriors, it slammed against an empiric shield thrown up by their sorcerers, who held its worst effects back with arcane formula fueled by their hatred. Most of the remaining Imperial Guardsmen died in seconds to the Sanguinius Scourge. Grelk's Skitarii fared better, but with their remaining biological components slewing from their frames, they were unable to halt the final push of the heretic assault tanks, which glowed with the Scourge's remnant radiation as they smashed through the fading resistance. Closing on the prize. With every new report that came in from his slave psychers throughout central Valentera, Czagra's calculating intellect worked to winnow the potential locations of the key fragment down further. Amongst the most promising targets was Uranic Lumen Sprawl. The status of the sprawl was a product of Lume 4's shifting political landscape. Formerly a bastion of the Imperial Creed, it had acrimoniously been ceded to the control of the Metallican tech priests 2 years before the invasion. The slow transfer of holy relics, entombed saints, and stasis caskets of irreplaceable religious nanoscripture was years from completion. Frantic as they were, the ecclesiastical priests refused to speed up the necessary rituals involved in relocating their treasures. By contrast, the tech priests had wasted no time in co-opting grand basilicas and holy bastions into forged temple annexes and storage chambers. To the fury of the confessors and archprelates, the tech priests had sheathed gaudy frescoes in lattices of dark iron, mounted macro cannons atop recently vacated tomb complexes, and demolished avenues of statuary to make way for thrumming power conduits. The tech priests of Uranic Lumen Sprawl had centralized their strategic command in an incense-filled data sanctum built into the former Benthid auto-shrine. Fortified with thermoplast alloys and haloed in a multi-layered void shield array, the data sanctum was deemed proof against even a lance strike from orbit. Embedded binaric sigil nets and cryo-cauterized wards protected it from the arcane attacks of a malignant scrap code that had seen other forge sprawls fall. The tech priests defended their stronghold and its surrounding sprawl with every efficient strategy they could muster. Full-on attacks by hundreds of servitors blunted the incursions of hordes of chaos cultists. Hidden reserves of Taraxii and Cerberus harassed the Iron Warriors' formations, managing to draw some out of position. A front line of Skitarii that moved slowly backwards, altering its frontage to minimize casualties, brought Czagra's warbands into range of ever more guns with every step they took. The Iron Warriors' assault soon lost most of its mortal contingent. Their every strategic lunge was blocked or deflected towards worthless regions of the sprawl, where they were isolated and attacked by packs of assassin constructs. With reluctance, the warband's leading champions reported their lack of progress to Czagra. The Warsmith, however, already knew. His cybertheurgic conclave of sorcerers and warpsmiths had detected the data sanctum's esoteric emissions, and the Warsmiths had closely monitored the attack on the forge sprawl with growing impatience. Every report from the handlers of slave psychers increasingly pointed towards Uranic Lumen Sprawl as the most likely location of Abaddon's key fragment, and so Czagra had bent his intellect into conquering it, should others fail him. Czagra first committed a portion of the reserves held within the Herald of Misery itself. Gunships and drop pods hurtled from launch bays and converted cradle scaffolds towards the points around the sprawl's curtain walls that were away from the failing warband's assaults. Others of his own warband, the Effacers of Mendringard, took a sheltered position before the sprawl's heaviest guns. Now came the second phase of Czagra's attack, recalled from 3 other offensives around central Valentera. More warbands began fighting their way through the Forge Sprawl suburbs from separate directions. Then, flocks of Helldrake demon engines and squads of Iron Warrior raptors descended from above to scour the upper reaches of the Sprawl's forged spires. Czagra imagined the frantic strategizing within the shielded data sanctum. He grudgingly credited the Sprawl's commanders with managing to hold at bay so many diverse assaults simultaneously. When Czagra's final blow struck, the tech priests of Uranic Lumen Sprawl had no reserves with which to counter it. A large force of Czagra's Effacers of Mendringard, including several squads of his elite bronze-wrought Terminators, hit in a single overwhelming attack. The tech priest's overloaded stratagem collapsed. With Czagra taking grim satisfaction as his cybertheurges detected the moment of horror that radiated from the data sanctum, Uranic Lumen Sprawl's defense did not last for another hour. The final adjustment. In the battle's aftermath, Czagra's slave psychers picked through the fire-blackened and gore-spattered ruins. Their handlers reported they were sure the forged sprawl held the key fragment. All that remained was to unearth the item, wherever it was, from whichever hidden vault or forgotten shrine in which it lay. The Grand Marshal of Ruin had already begun to contemplate the ways in which he would sunder the world utterly when an urgent vox message reached him. Vernok and Mandrax had failed. The loyalist vermin he had ordered his lieutenants to hunt down were alive. There would be consequences, but first the error had to be corrected. Vernok's message claimed he was convinced the Loyalists' route would take them to the warp portal. Czagra calculated the risk of them interfering with his ability to send the key fragment to Abaddon through the portal, then acknowledged the message from Vernok's pawn and dispatched several of his own missives to warbands on the surface, and others still within the Herald of Misery. The Warpsmith's machine-like mind assessed a dozen ways in which he would see the Loyalists fail and be humbled. If they were intent on reaching the warp portal, he would be there to welcome them. The Rite of Echoes. Aboard the Herald of Misery, Strikeforce Rallian had escaped the trap laid by the champions of Warpsmith Czagra. The bloodied Space Marines pushed on through the Ark of Omen towards its warp portal. If they could reach that arcane structure, they might yet complete their mission, but the gambit looked more desperate by the moment. The warp portal of the Herald of Misery was located within the carcass of a once mighty Imperial star fort. This crumbling edifice jutted from the Ark's dorsal plane like an ancient palace half drowned in a metal sea. The running battles that had raged within the Ark of Omen since Strikeforce Rallian boarded now approached the fortress from the levels below. To avoid being trapped as they had almost been within the screaming decks, the Loyalists had divided their forces. Librarians Rallian and Bakir led one spearhead. Psychic energy shimmering around them, they sprinted along corridors and gantries, pounded up steps and over the bolt-slain bodies of traitors, driving ever closer to their destination. Even as they fought, the two librarians gathered their mental might and practiced the chants of the Rites of Echoes. They would likely have just one chance to perform it when they reached the Ark's warp portal. They had to succeed, or the consequences for the Imperium itself might be dire. Following came a second force that was assigned the role of rear guard, led by Blood Angel's Lieutenant Leodas. These battle brothers had sworn to hold Vernok the Grey, Carbor, Mandrax, and their pursuing warbands at bay, maintaining their fighting retreat even at the cost of their own lives. As the ferocity of the heretics' breakthrough attempts intensified, and Leodas's losses mounted, that price looked likely to be paid in full. Last gasp. Surface of Lumen 4. While battle raged across Lume 4, victorious Iron Warriors consolidated their position within the Uranic Lumen sprawl. Packs of slave psychers combed the ruins, dragging their handlers behind them. The accursed hybrids converged upon the heart of the sprawl and clawed at the rubble, desperate to plunge into the catacombs below. Down in those crumbling depths, it seemed, the key fragment awaited. Yet, even as the Dark Mechanicum excavator engines gouged the earth, and bands of heretics and chosen pushed down through the catacombs, the vengeful wrath of the Loyalists broke against the Iron Warriors anew. The ground shook beneath the tread of Knights of House Krast, led by the mighty Reaver Titan, Ecclesiam Fortis, and supported, albeit somewhat belatedly, by a host of battle sisters. Battle erupted through the ruins of the Uranic Lumen sprawl as a beleaguered Iron Warrior staged a bitter holding action. The Loyalists, they knew, could not be permitted to prevent the recovery of Abaddon's key fragment, or Warpsmith Czagra's wrath would be terrible indeed. Fire tore through the smoke-wreathed ruins. Iron Warriors' battle tanks ground over rubble and corpses, trading fire with loping knights and zealous Adeptus Sororitas. Ecclesiam Fortis strode through the savagery like a god of war, and with its every pounding footfall, more of the chambers and catacombs below the ground collapsed upon the increasingly frantic heretic search parties. Even at this hour, it appeared the Iron Warriors, and thus the Despoiler, would be denied their arcane prize. The third band of loyalists was the smallest, but their duty was vital. We assessed the cogitator network in the Screaming Decks. Tech Marine Chalmo had brought down the force field entrapping Rallian's strike force. While doing so, he had also located a bank of operational savior pods. The escape vessels were situated at the bottom of a mechanical ravine that split a section of the Ark's outer hull and, according to Chalmo's data auguries, required an outer bulkhead to be blown and a handful of jutting construction armatures to be cleared from their parts before they could be launched. He had split off from the push towards the warp portal, accompanied by the survivors of Scout Squad Gatello and Infiltrator Squad Titania, to clear this exfiltration route. Whatever the librarians learned in the portal chamber would be useless if they could not escape the Ark of Omen. While the loyalist boarding parties battled towards their objectives, the Ark's master was not idle. Alert to the threat of the warp portal, Warpsmith Czagra had determined to crush the invaders in person. He was freed to do so by the report that the key fragment had been secured. Issuing commands for the execution of Lume 4 to commence in earnest, the Grand Marshal of Ruin turned away from the surface war, gathered a band of his effacers of Mendringard and, accompanied by the sorcerer Mekrantir, made for the nearest functional launch bay. Czagra's warriors boarded an ancient stormbird, which took flight and leapt out into the void, guided by Iron Warrior's pilots fused with their instruments. The Stormbird streaked low over the ironclad mountain ranges and light-speckled chasms of the Herald of Misery's hull. They weaved between newly raised Vox antennae, unimaginably ancient Xenos weapon turrets and grotesque flesh-metal extrusions the size of hab blocks, before coming in to land in one of the Star Fortress's embarkation decks. The fragment seized. Surface of Lume 4. Amidst the ruins of the Uranic Lumen sprawl, the Iron Warriors' lines buckled at last before an unstoppable charge by the Knights of House Krast. In almost the same instant, Bronze-wrought Chosen and Dark Magi broke through into the innermost reliquarium deep below. There they found the key fragment, an ancient and fire-blackened cogitator bank with a winged sword embossed upon its flank. Alerted by the Magi in the catacombs, twisted beings aboard the Herald of Misery engaged ancient teleporter arrays, locking onto hastily deployed runic emanators and snatching the key fragment and those who had recovered it from Lume 4. With his prize no longer at risk, Warpsmith Czagra was freed to vent his fury on the battlefield below. Orders crackled through the Iron Warrior's Vox channels. All those Czagra considered worthy were commanded to fall back from battle. The champions who had failed in the first assault against the Lumen Sprawl and had been forced to beg for aid were instead ordered to hold their ground, they and their warbands forming a sacrificial rearguard against the overwhelming Imperial numbers. If any survived the fire and bloodshed to come, Czagra would consider them worthy to rejoin his armies. With that, the first of the colossal bombardment cannons on the Herald of Misery opened fire. A storm of ordnance flashed down through the planet's atmosphere and engulfed the remains of the Lumen Sprawl in a cataclysmic firestorm. This was only the beginning. As more Iron Warrior warships settled into low orbit over Lume 4, and the traitor ground forces fell back to prearranged extraction points, a thunderous global bombardment commenced that sounded the death knell of an entire world. This was a swift but risky approach, for the superstructure of the Starfort was prone to collapse, or occasionally even sudden and violent mutation. Yet Czagra had no patience for further failures, and he had not attained his position of power without taking risks. Hastening through the crumbling corridors, Czagra and his warband rendezvoused with the Chosen, who had brought the key fragment up from the doomed world below. Still locked in its stasis field, the fragment was now fed into a grotesque biomechanoid walking reliquary, the better to transport it swiftly into the waiting portal. Then, with the monstrous reliquary scuttling in their midst, Czagra's warband made for the portal chamber. He would beat the loyalists to it, and have a cruel welcome waiting when they arrived. The portal chamber. Rallian Bakir and their surviving warriors were only a deck below the portal chamber when a wave of cultists and chaos spawns surged from side corridors to engulf them. Behind came iron warriors of the Wire Serpent's warband, intent on claiming the Liberians' heads and presenting them to Czagra. The loyalists fought furiously, some of the Blood Angels surrendering to the grip of the Red Thirst. They would not be denied when they were so close to their objective. Epistolary Rallian sent pinpoint bursts of psychic fury lancing out at the Iron Warriors, felling them one by one as his powers boiled their brains in their skulls. Dismayed cultists fell back from the ominous bow wave of Rallian's psychic presence and the bewildering illusions conjured by Codicia Bakir. Bolt shells and jets of roaring flame leapt from the Blood Angels' weapons to slaughter swathes of foes, yet more heretics poured into the chamber by the moment. Despite their best efforts, the loyalists seemed about to be overrun. It was at that moment that the battling forces of Lieutenant Leodas and Vernok the Grey boiled up from the level below to collide with the raging battle. Acting with selfless haste, Leodas had his warriors strike at the columns that held up the chamber's roof, bringing down a thundering avalanche of twisted metal and sparking wires. The collapse crushed dozens of heretics and cut most of them off in the librarian's diminished force. It also trapped what remained of Leodas's command on the wrong side of the wreckage, facing Vernok Mandrax and an overwhelming horde of heretics. Determined that Leodas and his battle brothers would not die in vain, Rallian and Bakir led the last of their warriors up a spike-studded ramp and into the dancing warplight of the portal chamber. Once this space had compromised the central command decks of the Star Fortress. Empiric necrotization had eroded the once austere chambers and corridors. In places, they had run into one another like wax, or burst forth in mutated growths until they formed a cavernous and raddled space like some huge ironwort vermin burrow. At the very heart of this hideous space blazed the warp portal. Cables and squirming organic extrusions flowed away from the infernal structure to mate with control consoles that reminded Epistolary Rallian of what he had seen aboard the Night Terror. There could be no mistake. This was the place. Warpsmith Czagra and his warriors burst from the tunnels on the opposite side of the portal chamber. Seeing the much-reduced loyalist boarding party illuminated by the unholy empiric glare, they surged to the attack. Bolt shells rocketed across the open space in both directions. Several rounds were engulfed in rippling flares of energy that burst from the portal to transform them into gobbets of protean sludge. Showers of spinning crystals or bursts of light and sound that pained even the Space Marine's enhanced senses to behold. The last survivors of Blade Guard Veteran Squad Aurelian stepped forward and raised their shields to protect the librarians and sanguinary priest Donas from the incoming hail of heretic fire. Meanwhile, what remained of Intercessor Squad Agalno and Aggressor Squad Dantos spread out to either side of the yawning warp portal and engaged the Iron Warriors head-on. Aware that their forces were outnumbered and exposed, Rallian and Bakir began the Rite of Echoes at once. As their psychic powers quested out and their chanting voices echoed through the chamber, the air seemed to thicken, and the unnatural luminescence of the portal flared brighter and wilder. Inhuman voices screamed and howled from its depth, as a series of psi pulses rippled through the chamber and thrummed across the rippling membrane of the portal's surface. Had Czagra known the nature of the rite the Loyalists were performing, he would likely have responded differently. Yet the Warsmith knew only that these Space Marines had boarded his Ark of Omen in what appeared to be a forlorn hope assault. That they had paid a dreadful price to reach the warp portal, and that they now sought to interfere with it in some fashion. Assuming that his foes were trying to close or destroy the portal before the key fragment could pass through it, Czagra commanded his warband to guard the unholy requiem and ensure it reached the portal safely, Only once that goal was achieved were they permitted free rein to close on the Loyalists and slaughter them. So it was that, skittering through a ferocious crossfire, its vile form shielded by the ceramite-clad bodies of Czagra's elites, the reliquary beast plunged into the warp portal with the key fragment held safe in the unnatural sub-realm of its gullet. As the warp portal roiled furiously and bore the reliquary through the Imperium and across vast galactic spaces, so the pulsing psychic resonance of the Rite of Echoes rippled along with it. Pressing forward, Czagra smashed one of the surviving Blade Guard aside and loomed over the chanting librarians with the sneer of contempt. As he did, the sorcerer Mekrantir howled a warning and threw out a counter-curse, attempting to halt a shockwave of immaterial feedback boiling from the portal. Psychic forces and unholy magic roiled together and then detonated in a shockwave of unreality that hurled everyone in the chamber from their feet. Tendrils of lashing ectoplasm surged from the surface of the portal, snatching up 2 intercessors and an iron warrior and dragging them into the warp. Mekrantir writhed and shrieked as an unleashed entity tore at his mind, seeking to take possession of his mortal form. Both Loyalist librarians weathered the shockwave, though not without cost. Relian's psychic hood sparked and smoked, its psycho-circuitry burnt out during its efforts to preserve his life and soul. Bakir lay motionless, his body plunged into a Suzanne coma by the catastrophic mental trauma he had suffered. Yet, as Relian staggered to his feet, his mind burning, his eyes weeping bloody tears, and the black rage threatening to burst through his weakened spiritual defenses, he felt a flicker of triumph. The warp pulse had brought with it more than just malevolence. It had also borne knowledge, echoing back from fathomless depths of insanity and horror. The rite had succeeded, at least in part. Venato Relian found that he knew with absolute certainty where the Herald of Misery's warp portal, where all the warp portals and all the Arks of Omen led. The Somnian stars, he breathed, blue-grey steam wisping from between his lips. The Idolatros system. The vital knowledge was imprinted on his consciousness with the indelible violence of a burning brand. Now he just had to escape and bear his painful revelation away to those who could make use of it. The Iron Crusade. In the wake of their raid on the Herald of Misery, the Blood Angels and the Tome Keepers had made good their escape. Some had fled the ship, while others had fallen back into the Ark's perilous depths and dared the Iron Warriors to give chase. Warpsmith Czagra was left to manage the aftermath of this assault upon his flagship and to lay plans for what came next. Though their numbers had been few, and the Herald of Misery was immense by anyone's measure, still the damage the Loyalists had caused was considerable. Their ritual had triggered a pulse of empiric energy from the Ark's warp portal that had rippled through the colossal vessel from prow to stern. Its effects had been felt most keenly in the portal chamber, in the form of partial structural collapse, architectural mutations, and a rash of malefic possessions amongst Czagra's favoured bronze-wrought. Elsewhere, the warp pulse triggered stranger phenomena. A plague of murderous geists erupt from the sarcophagi of a funeral barge melded deep within the Ark's dorsal crags. Miles of intertwined cables and wires mutated into sparking serpentine horrors that burst from the walls of multiple vessels to hunt live prey. The rust-hued fungal growth infesting part of the Ark erupted into rapid growth and overran the territories of the Smog Giants and Thunderscarp Guard warbands. These were but a handful of the bizarre phenomena that racked the Herald of Misery. Warpsmith Czagra's wrath was terrible. He made bloody examples amongst those he held responsible for the Royalists' escape. He dispatched malevolent hunters with orders not to return until they had tracked down the interlopers and taken vengeance upon them. He commanded a conclave of warpsmiths and masters of possession to repair the damage done throughout his ark. threatening dire consequences if they did not meet his punishing schedule. Once he was satisfied that the Loyalists had not endangered the ultimate survival of his flagship, Czagra's attention shifted. He was, above all, a being of methodical pragmatism. He still had a system-wide war to win. In a mood most unmerciful, the Grand Marshal of Ruin returned to slaughtering a system. Iron cold and cruel. Lume 4 died first. Those heretic forces not quick enough to reach designated extraction points perished along with it. Czagra directed the fury of every warship he had in orbit against the luckless world and, with all 4 of its orbital platforms now scuttled or destroyed, there was no one left to interfere. Kinetic spears, searing lance beams and rains of barrage bombs reduced sprawl after sprawl to ruin. With no supporting vessels in orbit, there was nowhere for Imperial evacuation craft to go should they escape the planet's atmosphere. This did not stop many from attempting to flee, but nearly all were cut to pieces by the ruthless gunnery of the Iron Warrior's void ships. Mere hours after Czagra ordered Lumen 4 put to death, the weapon systems of the Herald of Misery were carving a blazing skull 1,000 miles across into the carcass of a slaughtered world. The system's other worlds also met cataclysmic conclusions to their suffering at the hands of the Iron Warriors. On Lume 2, thermoreactive dome shields protected the hive cities from the killing heat of the nearby star. Fanatical cult insurgents, serving the Ferrocrete creed, struck at the shield's macro-stanchions and demolished one after another. The shields fell in miles-wide storms of tumbling glass, and the lethal energies of the star swept down in their wake. The crystal-riven mining world of Lume 9, meanwhile, saw its rigs and platforms depopulated by boarding parties of Iron Warriors, led by Dark Magos Brughost. The facilities were stripped of technology and resources, then left as dark charnel houses doomed to be crushed by the planet's endlessly replicating crystal deposits. These peripheral campaigns had barely ended when Czagra commanded his scattered forces to rally to his side. He had begun the invasion of the Lume system with a mighty Baal fleet, but Imperial resistance had been stiff and casualties heavy. There would be much work to do, replenishing Czagra's ranks and rebuilding his fleet before he could wage war on this scale again. Nevertheless, the Grand Marshal of Ruin would not leave Leona Stellarium unconquered in his wake. He also would not countenance another failed assault upon the Void Fort, and he determined to strike with all his remaining strength and crush both the fort and its recently returned defense fleet with a single decisive hammer blow. Extinguished. Mustering such might across interplanetary distances was not swift. By the time Czagra's fleet swept down upon Leona Stellarium, his victims had made best use of the time they had been afforded. The Force astropaths had amassed their mind choir and sent Strike Force Rallian's warning racing out along heavily encrypted channels. Covered by a pair of Mars-class battlecruisers, the Dauntless-class light cruiser Oracle of Thalis had sped from Leona Stellarium and run the chrome pickets of chromite beast warships to escape the system. Aboard it went several Imperial dignitaries considered too important to perish aboard Leona Stellarium and the survivors of Strike Force Rallian. These were the only loyalists to leave the Lume system. However, all those who remained had sworn to exact what vengeance they could for the cold-blooded murder of 3 Imperial worlds. Then came Czagra, wielding the might of the Herald of Misery, the surviving vessels of the mighty Baal fleet, and a fearful host of Iron Warriors and their allies. The defiant loyalists fought hard, driven by hatred and faith, yet their desire for vengeance was as nothing to Czagra's terrible wrath. Warships of traitors and loyalists alike burned in the void. The blood-drenched decks of Leona Stellarium were swept clear of boarders once, twice, a third time. And then, when Warpsmith Czagra was sure his foes had been sufficiently worn down, The Herald of Misery swept into the battle with its myriad batteries and esoteric superweapons blazing. Swarms of fighters and bombers billowed from its launch decks. The battle's end came swiftly after that, the Warpsmith himself delivering the killing blow with a teleport attack upon the Void Fortress's stratagem decks. So were the final shots in the war for the Lume system fired, the final defenders slain, and their bold last stand brought to a bloody end. Path to Glory. As his Bale fleet cut a swathe across Imperial space, Warpsmith Czagra led one military campaign after another. Some conflicts were left to his champions to manage, while others saw squadrons of his Bale fleet's vessels ranging far from his ark, only to return with fresh battle scars and plunder. Yavos 9. Warpsmith Czagra was concluding his campaign in the Ajarga system when a demonic envoy of twisted flesh and machinery came before him. The entity represented Vashtor the Arkifane, and it brought word that the Blackened Tower Bale fleet had been plunged into internecine conflict by an infestation of enslavers and was no longer able to claim its allotted key fragment. If Czagra completed the mission in their stead, Vashtor would repay him with a legion of specialized demon engines marched fresh from the Soul Forges. The possibility of such a prize overcame even Czagra's weariness of demonic machinations. The Grand Marshal of Ruin accepted Vashtor's contract and turned his Bale fleet for Yavos 9. That world turned out to be colossal, a superplanet gripped by extreme gravity, and lent a gnarled appearance by the thousands of deep chasms splitting its surface. Hydroelectric shrines harvested the power of the world's torrential rivers and fed it into fortified habdomes, mining complexes, and orbital defense silos. Unlike Lume 4, the psychic spore of the key fragment here seemed strong and clear. The envoy had provided Czagra with fresh slave psychers to help him complete his mission, and all now gibbered and screamed about the planet's northernmost dome, Complex 13. This then became the Iron Warrior's target. Their planetary assault was swift, savage, and overwhelming. Czagra did not intend to waste longer than he must, running errands for demons. Instead, he hurled wave upon wave of assault craft into a landing zone centered around Complex 13, while the Herald of Misery and its accompanying warships unleashed bombardments to stave off the Imperial armored columns racing to reinforce the beleaguered dome. What followed was a ferocious conflict, as Iron Warrior siege tanks, Havocs, and Legionaries shattered one fortified defense line after another. The Loyalists fought back with the desperate strength of cornered prey. Their companies of Ogrin Auxilia held the city's inner domes despite mounting casualties, while their defense lasers punched several of Czagra's warships out of orbit as flaming wreckage. In the end, however, the wrath of an entire Bale fleet could not be resisted by the defenders of one world, never mind one city. After the traitor warlord Titan, Delirium Overkill shattered the Starspire Gate and the Iron Warriors outflanked the last Imperial defense lines, the end came quickly for Complex 13. Word of the invasion had barely even spread to Yavos 9's southern domes before the planet's key fragment, an ancient Space Marine helm painted onyx black and crowned with steel wings, was being ferried up to the Herald of Misery aboard a Stormbird gunship. So did Warpsmith Czagra secure the might of an entire legion of infernal demon engines. The Bulkhead War. In first conquering the Herald of Misery, Czagra had faced furious opposition by the Orcs of war boss Grimzag, who very much considered the vessel his, lacking the time or strategic stability to crush the Orcs decisively. The Warpsmith had instead driven them back into a sector of the Ark's enormous prow, then ordered them sealed in. The Xenos had staged several violent breakouts since, each one stymied at considerable cost in lives. with the Herald of Misery's outer decks firmly under his control, and his forces bolstered by recent victories, Czagra elected to crush the Xenos before the Orc threat reached critical mass. The Iron Warriors launched a three-prong attack through the Hall of Beasts, the Withering Decks, and the mutated wreck of the Titania Apocalypsma. Using explosive charges, they demolished the walled walls they had raised to hold the Orcs at bay, blasting them back into enemy territory like enormous frag charges. Elite warbands of Iron Warriors stormed the resultant breaches, intending to steamroller any foes left reeling from the detonations. Instead, they were met head-on by hordes of roaring Xenos, pouring over their own blast-shredded dead from every chamber, corridor, and crawlway. In the withered decks, the Iron Warriors were driven back by clanking mobs of meganobs, whose custom blasters and howling killsaws transformed even bronze-wrought into torn metal and bloody meat. Elsewhere, Iron Warrior Warpsmiths were forced to collapse entire sections of the Titania Apocalypsma to stem the tide of Deathskull Orcs pushing them relentlessly back. Only in the Hall of Beasts, where Czagra led the assault, did his forces make swift and bloody headway, purging the Xenos from their breach zone before pushing out to secure the access shafts of the Tendril and the ransacked industrial decks lining the blackened smog chasm. These vicious brawls were but the opening salvos in a war that proved more brutal and prolonged than even Czagra's most pessimistic predictions. The Orcs' numbers had swelled alarmingly during their enforced captivity, and they had stripped mechanical systems throughout the proud decks to fashion an arsenal of ramshackle weapons and armor. Their pernicious fungal ecosystem had run riot, even infesting the biochemical extrusions of the Arks gangliaxos, where they spread through the region. Battle after battle, the fighting lines of Orcs and Iron Warriors flowed back and forth, until corridors became choked with corpses, and warp predators were drawn from the depths by the gore flowing shin-deep down stairways and ramps. The turning point came amidst ferocious fighting through the teetering under-gantries. Warboss Grimzag led a wild charge to shatter the Iron Warriors' lines and drive them from their fighting platforms into the bubbling sump pits below. Even as the massive Orc bellowed his victory cry through the echoing chambers, an axe blade clove his head in two from behind. Dripping with sump filth, his body twisted by fresh mutations, Carball Mandrax kicked the enormous Orc's corpse over the edge of the platform he himself had just clambered up to. What horrors the deranged master of executions had faced in the bowels of the Ark since his plummet into the pit none knew, but the experience seemed only to have rendered him more monstrous. Rallying to their risen champion, the Iron Warriors drove into the now leaderless Orcs and scattered their strength in every direction. So began a relentless advance that saw Czagra's forces push deep into Xenos territory and recapture deck after deck. The Orcs were neither eradicated nor truly defeated, but divided now between the banners of dozens of rival knobs and big bosses. So they broke apart and vanished into other regions of the Ark. The greatest greenskin threat had been neutralized. What factionalized infestations remained, Czagra left to his champions to hunt down, for he considered them beneath his notice. And no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. See you next Friday. Toodaloo.